Hey everyone, this is Mark Treichel with another episode of With Flying Colors. You're either listening on your favorite podcast app or you're watching on YouTube. Today I am going to have a podcast about the Donald Trump firing Tanya Otsuka and Todd Harper and the ramifications that is having on NCUA, and which triggered a couple letters coming from Elizabeth Warren and Maxine Waters to Kyle Hauptman. First, a letter to the NCUA IG, and talk about good timing. NCUA's IG retired just before this letter came out, and they have a person that is the acting IG who had to respond to Warren. And then when they got that letter, that triggered a letter from Warren to NCUA Board Chair Kyle Hauptman about the state of affairs at NCUA. Without further ado, oh, by the way, and the devil's in the details and the devil is in the footnotes. So there's some really good footnotes here that I'm going to dive into. And I'll just kind of walk through the letter here and give my commentary as I go through it. So, Kyle Hauptman, dear Chairman Hauptman, we write today to request information regarding the operation of the National Credit Union Administration, NCUA Board, in the wake of the illegal firings of the NCUA Board members Todd Harper and Tanya Otsuka. Specifically, we seek clarification on the board's legal authority to conduct standard NCUA business in the absence of a quorum and request additional documentation to better understand the NCUA board's recent actions. So here they're saying it was illegal. That's to be determined. So that's the position Harper and Otsuka have taken. We'll see what the judges say, but they want some information about the actions that have happened. And I've got podcasts on this. We'll walk through it again here because there's some updated information. We now have a list of what actions they actually took. And next paragraph, despite the critical importance of a fully staffed board to the NCUA operations, President Trump unlawfully fired NCUA board members Todd Harper and Tanya Otsuka on April 16th. As a result, you are the only board member remaining at the NCUA. In response, we wrote to the NCUA Officer of the Inspector General requesting an investigation of your authority to continue full agency operations with only one board member. Our latest requested information on what legal analysis, if any, the NCUA or other administration officials conducted to assess the firings, impact on the NCUA board, copies of all written communications and documents between NCUA officials, the White House, and other administration officials regarding the decision, and a list of actions taken by the NCUA board on or after April 16, 2025. The IG response included a troubling information that suggests neither the NCUA or the White House understands what actions the agency can lawfully take in the wake of the firings. According to documents provided to us by the IG, when there is only one NCUA board member serving on the board, individual board members may carry out any essential function on the NCUA board. You may recall that delegation went into play in the early 2000s. I've had a podcast about this, but I was the deputy executive director at the time, and there was only one board member, Dennis Dollar. Dennis Dollar asked the general counsel, what things can I do? And they said, well, you probably shouldn't vote on anything because there's a question about what a quorum is. They decided what he could do was have briefings. That's when the NCUSIF quarterly briefing was born. And he did another briefing, and then I think there were two meetings, and then he was joined by two additional board members, Joanne Johnson and Debbie Matz, who filled out the full complement, and then they could move forward with their full agenda. But by the end of that year, they said, hey, we should clarify some of this. And they put into NCUA's delegations that if there's only one board member, they can take essential actions and carry out any essential functions for the board. So what is essential? In the eye of the beholder. And that's what part of what the Democrats' problems are with what's going on at NCUA at this point in time. However, the IG was unable to produce any documentation that delineates between essential and non-essential functions. And that's consistent with what I said. There was never any definition of essential when I was at NCUA, and it doesn't sound like they've added that. So it's really what's in the eye of the beholder. Now, what is the definition of essential? Absolutely necessary, extremely important, a thing that is absolutely necessary. You need a budget to conduct business at NCUA. You could argue that is essential. They liquidated a credit union that that authority had already been placed with the regional directors for years. You could argue that in order to reduce the cost of the insurance fund and unsafe and unsound actions at that credit union, they needed to liquidate that credit union and live by the old delegations. Now, this is a new delegation, or was 25 years ago, where they said that essential actions can be taken by the NCUA when there's only one board member. But they're trying to get to the bottom of what actions have taken. Then they have a paragraph of the agency is responsible for the safekeeping of the $2.3 trillion in assets in the credit union system, most of which are the deposits of hardworking Americans saving for college, to buy a home, or saving for retirement. Credit unions currently serve more than 142 million members, and the absence of any meaningful description of what the agency can do during the period of time when it has one board member raises serious concerns and questions. Yeah, this is politics 101, but you may recall, or you may not be aware, but Elizabeth Warren was the architect of the CFPB. The CFPB has one person in charge of it. She was comfortable with it there, but she's not comfortable with it at NCUA. Now, that doesn't go to the fact that Congress established the Federal Credit Union Act. Congress said you do need to have a full board, but a little disingenuous because Warren was comfortable with the CFPB being led by one. She just doesn't want NCUA led by one because it's an R right now, and it flies in the face of the lawsuits that Harper and Otsuka have put in place, the actions that Trump has taken here and at other agencies. But in any event, they have a hat tip to, what's going on. You only have one leader. Moreover, there is a significant evidence to suggest that the NCUA board cannot fully function with only one board member. By statute, the NCUA board shall consist of 3 members. Yep. And a majority of the board shall constitute a quorum. The board has broad authority to oversee federal credit unions, including the power to prescribe rules and regulations. The board regulations make it clear that the agreement of at least 2 of the 3 board members is required for any action by the board. The regulation also provides that board cannot hold regular meetings if a quorum is not available. So their own regulation is probably, to me, their Achilles heels in this. They say they need 2 people to do anything that's a regulation. And if you wanted to say a regulation was essential, how can you do it if there aren't 2? Now, they have, I think, internally opined that a quorum is 1 if there is only 1. So you can meet the quorum. I've done some research on that. You can argue a quorum, you need at least 2, but if you have a homeowners association that's supposed to have 5 board members and you only have 2 board members, what's a quorum of 2? It would be 2. If everybody would resign but 1, you still need to go on. You still need to carry on at NCUA, at any organization with the board. So I would argue, and they are arguing, that with 1 board member, you need to be able to do certain things. And those things, as previously established by delegations approved by a full board, would be that those things would have to be essential things. But they go back to, have you defined essential? What is essential? What actions have you taken? And again, we'll get to that here shortly. The IG provided documents showing the delegations of certain authorities to the chair. For example, the chairman of the board was given the authority to act unilaterally during emergencies. In an emergency situation, the NCUA board chair may temporarily revoke certain delegations of any staff person, exercise all HR authorities retained by the board, place certain senior officials on administrative leave, and the chair in a state of national emergency may also exercise all authorities retained by the board. By the way, state of national emergency is what it sounds like. It has to be that the federal government, whether it's Homeland Security or the president, I'm trying to remember who actually makes that determination. If there isn't a state of national emergency defined elsewhere, NCUA cannot use that delegation. What else? There was something else here. Unilaterally during emergencies, an emergency may temporarily revoke. By the way, that delegation about revoking delegations is kind of redundant because when I was there, we added some language to the delegations that said the delegations flow through the chain of command. So when I was the executive director, if I didn't like how a regional director was doing on their delegations, I could revoke it and do that action myself. It flows all the way back to the board. Now, I never did that. I never wanted to do that. I never needed to do that because the RDs were doing a fabulous job, but the authority to do that is there. But I digress. Notably, however, the NCUA is not currently in a state of emergency, and outside of emergency situations, board members' ability to act is more limited. Agreed. According to the IG, the board has acted on 11 board action memorandums on or after April 16th. The IG found that former board member Todd Harper voted yes on one of the 11 items prior to his firing on April 16th. Pretty sure that's the one that authorized their buyouts at NCUA, which is a good thing because to me, at first I thought when I saw the list and the buyout program was on there, by the way, NCUA folks, if you're listening, I think your buyouts are safe because Todd voted on them. They don't say that's the one here that he voted on, but I have it from good intel. That's the one he voted on. Otherwise, however, you appear to have acted on dams unilaterally, again, without any consideration of whether these actions are essential functions of the NCUA board. So it's interesting. They are arguing that the delegations allow for essential functions, but there are only 3, and beyond essential functions, you can't really act. And I don't think you can have it both ways. I think it's smart that NCUA has this essential functions, and I helped put it in place back in the early 2000s. But at what juncture? Who's to define what essential is? The Act doesn't talk about it. Regulations don't talk about it. You clearly need to go on in the scenarios that exist, but let's say an accident happened and all 3 board members were together and they were gone. They have delegations that allow the executive director to act for the board. Well, I wouldn't have felt very comfortable having been the executive director having to do those things. And that would have been thrust upon me in my days had that happened. Thank God it didn't happen. But it's not consistent with the Federal Credit Union Act. And even this essential thing is not consistent with the Federal Act. Do you need something in place that allows you to do it? Sure, I agree with that. But they're getting into the weeds on what is essential, and I think it's a wise discussion to have. So to help us better understand the legitimacy of the board's activities during this time, we request the following no later than July 7th. So I'm looking forward to when they reveal this July 7th information. And oh, by the way, one of the things that could happen from this is because this is happening, you could see Donald Trump move quicker to replace those 2 board members. Will he do it before a court case is decided on the lawsuits? Not sure. But in the court cases, the government argued that even if you determine I could not have fired them, the solution to put them back is not the right solution. So the judge could say Trump was right. The judge could say Harper and Otsuka were right, but even though they were fired, the next president can't do this. We're not going to put the people in. And then theoretically Trump could put his own people in, which would be another Republican at least, and possibly a D. Maybe they just put an R in, and then all of this would resolve itself, except for the actions that may or may not have been taken in compliance with the delegations and or in compliance with the Federal Credit Union Act. By the way, I mentioned I did a podcast about a conservatorship. Conservatorship requires a board action. That cannot be delegated to staff. So Hauptman had to sign off on that delegation. That conservatorship. Was that essential? The argument would be, if we didn't do it, there would have been losses to the insurance fund. That's bad for everybody. I could make an argument. If the essential delegation is true and indeed legit, you could argue that could be done. You could also argue that there is no quorum, which is what is being argued here by Warren. In addition, since they haven't defined what essential is, you can do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. I don't believe they had. I know we never had, and they're implying here the IG said they hadn't, and they're kind of throwing some gasoline on a fire saying, hey, you haven't defined what essential is, but you're taking all these actions. What's essential, what isn't essential, et cetera, et cetera. So what they've asked for, what constitutes an essential function of the NCUA board? Please provide the statutory provision this authority is based on. There is none. And provide copies of all documents that include any official definitions or description of this term. There is none, or there was none when I was there, or which seems consistent with what the IG has said, as I just summarized. If no documents exist, please provide examples of past actions of the NCUA board that have been deemed an essential function and why. For each of the 11 BAMs the IG identified as having been acted on, please explain whether any qualify as an essential function. Of course, they're all going to qualify, right? Because if they haven't built this, they're going to build it retroactively to show that the actions he took fit the definition. Retrofit, I think, is what we'll call that. As identified in question 1, if you identify any of the BAMs as an essential function, please explain why. Please provide any contemporaneous legal analysis justifying this determination, including on what statutory provision this analysis is based on. Number 3, what constitutes an emergency situation? Under the NCUA's delegation of authority, what constitutes a state of national emergency? Please provide copies of all documents offering official definitions or descriptions of these terms, including on what statutory provision this authority relies on. If no document exists, please provide examples when this emergency authority was invoked. Pretty sure I'm the one who presented that change to the NCUA board at a board table, and there would have been a BAM and no preamble because it wasn't a regulation. But this is my recollection that the emergency was linked to the outside government definitions of it. So NCUA, if you're listening, go back to when that delegation was put in place. My recollection is I presented it, and there might have been questions relative to it. So, hey, maybe my statements about what it means will make its way to Elizabeth Warren as they're weaving their way through this. Is the NCUA currently operating in an emergency situation? The answer is no. Or a state of national emergency? The answer is no, based on what I just previously said. If so, please provide all written communication and documents, including but not limited to meeting schedules, records, analysis, and the correspondence between NCUA officials and between NCUA officials and other administration officials regarding the emergency situation or state of national emergency. Trump just bombed Iran, and that hasn't led to a state of national emergency. So clearly, NCUA is not in a state of national emergency. Okay, I digress. Are there additional delegations, authority, if any, at the NCUA relevant to the chair's ability to act individually in the absence of a quorum? If so, please provide a detailed description of those delegations along with any legal analysis. The IG was informed that no one at the NCUA, including the board chairman, chief of staff, knew about the removals until they occurred, so there was no communication between NCUA officials and the White House or the administration officials in advance of the firings. Please confirm this. Additionally, what communications between NCUA officials and the White House or other administrative officials regarding the firings occurred on or after April 16th? Please provide copies of all written communications and documents, including but not limited to meeting schedules, records, analysis, and other correspondence. I needed a sip of water. Given the independent agencies like NCUA are now required by a presidential executive order to submit draft regulations for approval by an office within the White House Office of Management and Budget, aka OMB, have you or your staff had any communications with such White House officials about whether NCUA is able to issue regulations as a one-member board? They've argued that they can. A leaked email from NCUA Executive Larry Fazio said, remain calm, we can do whatever we want. So not sure if what they're asking for here has happened, but that is NCUA's current position, apparently. If so, please provide copies of all written communications and documents. In an email to the NCUA General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel on April 16th, the NCUA Chief of Staff indicated that she wanted to talk briefly about any risks we might face going forward related to the firings. What risks did the Chief of Staff, General Counsel, Deputy General Counsel, and any other officials identify as facing the NCUA in the wake of the firings? I argued in my conservatorship podcast that maybe Hauptman didn't have the authority to conserve a credit union, and there's a 10-day window for someone to contest a conservatorship. I believe they could have made that argument and possibly had the conservatorship reversed, but that's a high legal threshold. You have to prove that it was arbitrary and capricious, not arbitrary or capricious, arbitrary and capricious, two complicated legal words. So those are the types of risks that could be pointed to here. So there's the IG response that went back to Warren and Waters on May 6th. That was a footnote by the acting inspector general. And what really caught my eye was the fact that they had a list that was a footnote of all the actions Hauptman had taken. And here's what they are. There was a vote on April 18th to establish the semi-annual agenda. I have not seen what that agenda is, but they took a vote by notation vote. With notation vote, typically, if you have 3 board members, all 3 board members can decide it doesn't need to go to a board meeting. You know, there's open board meetings that have to be done in the open. There's closed board meetings that have some confidential issues like personnel or an appeal, for example. A notation vote, if there's 3 board members, any board member can bring can trigger that, saying, hey, I may vote for this, but I want to have a discussion on the record. And NCUA has gotten notoriously, I don't want to say lazy, because that's not the right word. They don't take things to closed board meetings. They do it all by notation vote because it's easier for them. It's easier for staff, and it's not on the record. There's no dialogue that happens. But I think they've driven a truck through the delegations that say what you can do by notation vote. There should be some things that are probably done by notation vote that should be done at a meeting, and there should be some level of discussion. But hey, if they're getting along so well and they can work it out behind the scenes, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, why not do it by notation vote? Clearly, if I was there as a staff member, I would prefer notation vote because it's simpler. All right, so what happened? They had the semi-annual agenda approved on April 18th. Also on April 18th, they had the board appeal, request for oral hearing, appeal of a denial of a credit union change in officials. So somebody who was in a troubled institution, meaning a 4 or 5, was denied the ability to serve, and somebody appealed that and voted on that himself. Was that essential? It was essential probably because the person had due process. That would be my argument if I was NCUA and you had to provide that due process. Notation vote on the schedule policy career petition to OPM on April 21st. That's a little wonky of a subject. I'm going to guess that relates to something they had to provide to OPM in order to do their buyouts. So this is where it could get complicated. If someone wanted to say you didn't have the authority to do this, and there were pieces that Hauptman approved after Harper left, theoretically, you could argue that somebody could say you didn't have the authority to do the buyouts. I don't think that'll happen, because who would want to make that statement? And it would be a heavy burden to prove anyway, but that's theoretically a possibility. Notation vote, the NCUA Deferred Resignation Program, approval to request SSPs postpone paid administrative leave. So this is an instance where Harper had approved the plan with Hauptman, and they've decided that they wanted to weave in approval to request SSPs postpone paid administrative leave. So they were requesting staff who were put on leave. They were creating a carve-out saying, hey, we'd like you to stay longer, and they wanted to make that request as part of the plan. Notation vote, SSP performance standards. So they changed something in NCUA's performance appraisal system. My guess is Hauptman wanted to put something in that the White House said needed to be in, or OPM said they needed to be in, and it needed to be fixed. Or it was just something that Hauptman wanted, probably not that. So this was probably deemed essential because OPM or Trump asked for it. A change in the NCUA delegation revisions. It's possible. I would love to see that document, the April 25th change to NCUA delegations, but those are revisited on occasion. For example, there's asset thresholds on a loss. If a loss to close a credit union is going to be over a certain threshold, $2 or $3 million, don't have them in front of me, the regional director can do it themselves. There's a loss threshold where it has to be the regional director with concurrence of the Office of Examination of Insurance, and then there's a loss threshold where it has to come to the NCUA board. There are similar thresholds for buying a bank, which is something that they were very close to changing at one point in time. Hopefully that's a change they made. But they tweaked the delegations. Was that essential? I guess that really would determine what changes were made, but clearly they said it was essential because he took the action. They revised the examination schedule policy. So this, they had to do this because they're getting rid of 25% of their staff due to the buyouts. They don't have the staff to do the old policy. By the way, they couldn't do the exams on time. When they were fully staffed, they tweaked their policy at the beginning of the year, and then the firings happened, and then the buyouts happened, so it went from bad to worse. And they're in a triage state right now. So this makes sense that they had to do this, but again, arguing that because Trump said do buyouts, we had to do buyouts, we need to change our policies, therefore it's essential that I vote on this. That would be the argument that I would make. Makes sense. Notation vote, simplification of the share insurance and succession planning rules, solicitation of comments. So they requested comments on those two rules that were finalized under Harper. They came out and said they're taking comments on these regulations. Now, this is where it gets to that regulation that says the regulation on how to do regulations, which says they have to have 2 board members. You could argue that he doesn't have the authority. Is it essential that they change succession planning? Well, they could do succession planning via a rule, which they did. They could do succession planning via guidance. They could argue that they want to do that. But is it essential that they made these two changes? I think that's a weak argument, but hey, that's just me. Notation vote action number 9, personnel acting appointments and reassignments. They have delegations of authority on who can select who for what positions. So, for example, the executive director, the regional directors, the inspector general, those positions can only be approved by the board. The which is an SSP 3 position, the SSP 1s and 2s, theoretically lower level, the executive positions, those can be approved by the executive director. They weren't always done that way. The boards typically would actually vote on those. And so there were some things that needed to be done to put people in place, like the acting inspector general, which is the next item, appointment of an acting inspector general. You need an inspector general. You can only act in the short term 120 days without be putting into a position or rotating in other people. And again, they're in triage mode. They need to follow the rules to the best they can, and I'm guessing there are some temporary promotions tied to this, and I'm trying to remember OPM has established some things the agencies can do in these scenarios, but hopefully these people who are stepping up are getting paid for it. And then they approved an open board meeting transcript for the January 16th, 2020. So he reviewed the transcript and approved it. Is that essential? I don't know. Maybe the reg says they have to do it. That would be the argument. So they've taken 11 actions, some of them interesting, some of them benign. And then the 12th action was that conservatorship, which again, I have a podcast out there called It Was a Bold Move. Why was it bold? Because you could argue, as is Waters and Elizabeth Warren. I don't know why I can't remember her name. I can see her in my head. Elizabeth Warren and Maxine Waters, as they're arguing, they're doing things you don't have the authority to do. You are doing things under a definition of essential, which hasn't been defined. So we'll see where this goes. We'll see if the lawsuits of Harper and Otsuka are decided before this letter goes out. But interesting times in credit union land. And again, we have Warren and Waters versus Trump. We have Warren and Waters supporting Harper and Otsuka. And by the way, this letter reads, too good for it having been written by somebody on the Hill, too good for it to have been written by Warren or Waters or their staff. In my opinion, this was written by Harper, Otsuka, and their law firm, and they are that connected, both Harper and Otsuka. Otsuka came from Sherrod Brown's staff on the banking committee. Harper was with Senator Sarbanes and had the juice to get the ability to serve as a board member for 11 years in 2 terms and get that definition of what a full term is swapped. So those 2 folks have the juice. They have a law firm. I think those 3 people worked together to get this letter into Warren and Waters' hands. Did they tweak it and did they sign it, making it their letter? Of course they did, but I think it came from somebody very close to the system, and probably Harper was a huge architect of this letter. All right, I'm losing my voice here on a Sunday morning. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. As more information becomes available on this, I will update you here and on LinkedIn and via my mailing list. As always, I appreciate you listening. I hope you'll listen or watch again soon. This is Mark Treichel signing off with Flying Colors.